Hi, and welcome to the Nine-Sided Circle. This is March 8th, I believe. Yes, and it is the first day of daylight savings time in the US, so we're gonna be making that shift. We're all doing that together. And, well, as you need to know every week, I am Noor Kyle, and this is my co-host.
Mushtaq Ali, right here.
Yes, and as always, you can click that like button, click that subscribe button if you haven't already so that you can join us every week when we talk about subjects related to the inner work of growing spiritually, becoming a whole person. This week, we're going to be talking about the levels of ego. We're going to be expounding on what ego is and how to grow out of our pattern behaviors that make us behave like machines rather than human beings.
Is that
Take
my
it away,
cue?
Mushtaq. Yeah.
Okay. So, what do we mean by ego? This is related to the Arabic word nafs, the Hebrew word nefesh, um, and all of that kind of stuff. And ego is the mind of the body, is one way to look at it. We all have one. We all need one. The purpose of our ego, our personality, as it were. And interestingly enough, tonight's talk will dovetail with the whole idea of the Enneagram of the chief feature and the bastardized Enneagram of personality. Did I say that out loud? Shit. And all of these sorts of things. But this is an old traditional teaching to help you understand the stages of transformation that the egoic self goes to as you move from basically a stimulus response meat machine to someone whose essence is awake and free of identification. Now, traditionally, this is viewed as having 7 stages. Now, I should say at this point again, this is just a model. This is not actual reality. This is a way of looking at reality and trying to make sense of it. So it's a model. You don't have to believe this. As a matter of fact, I would prefer that you not believe this, but you can use it to see if it works well with your process, with your practice. So 7 levels, 7 layers. What that means is in the beginning, you have this first station that you're at, which is called the commanding self. Are you able to do the typing on this, Noor?
Yes, I am able to cut and paste and type things
Okay,
out now.
good. Then I won't worry about that.
Good.
You cut and paste better than I do, as well as spell better than I do. So we have this thing, this persona, this ego that we build, and it is of the body. It is part of the meat. It is the neurological part of the self. It is also, according to this model, purely a stimulus response mechanism. It is robotic in nature, and it gives you basic stimulus to behave in particular ways. The thing is that for at least the last 6,000 years, maybe longer, it has kind of taken over the functions of other parts of ourselves that should be doing jobs that the ego is doing for us. So, the basic premise, your ego is mechanical. Because throwing Arabic words at you is not terribly useful in most cases because you don't speak Arabic. Um, I usually refer to this part of you as the machine because it is something of an object. And we say that in the state of the commanding self of the nafs al-amara, the machine is asleep. The machine is asleep and it's having nightmares because its purpose is to keep you alive. That's its main function. The machine is what operates when you accidentally touch something really hot and you go, oh, right? That happens faster than thought. That reflex of touching something hot and pulling your hand away has no part in conscious thought. There's no you deciding, oh, this is burning my hand, I think I'll move it. There's about a third of a second delay between stimulus and response in the conscious mind, and there is virtually no delay in touching something hot and jerking your hand back. There's a martial arts secret in there somewhere. We will get to that at some later date. So here you are. You are mostly just going through the world and responding mechanically to the various stimulus. And we see this every day. Think of all of the people who, when you say something, you know how they're going to respond. And even if you tell them, hey, you're going to respond like this when I tell you this, and they say, no, I won't, they will. Have you guys experienced that? Anybody here not experienced that? Okay, good. The trouble with having the machine asleep and having its job being your survival is that, like with most nightmares, it basically assumes everything is dangerous. Think about that for a second. Everything is frightening. This is why we say that the basic tone of the human being who has not worked on themselves is fear. You get afraid of everything. You're afraid of the good things as well as the bad things. You're afraid of intimacy, love, companionship, all of these things. You're afraid of good food and bad food. You're afraid of traveling to interesting places. Everything is scary.
Is this at the foundational level, you mean?
This is at the foundational level.
Yeah.
This is at the commanding self. And
Yeah.
what the commanding self does is it commands you to react along set patterns to different stimulus. Now, for some of us, sometime in our life, something goes, hey, maybe there's something else. Or somebody around you goes, hey, wake up. And you have a moment of clarity. Now, we should say something about essence here. The Arabic word is dhat, which is pronounced either dahat or zat. And I'm going to use zat because it's easier for everybody to say. And that means essence, not essential self, but essence. This is the core component of you as a being. This essence is fixated on and fascinated by the works of the machine right now. in most cases. This is what in the Yoga Sutras they call this the seer. You know, when the twistings and turnings of the mind stops, the seer is in its proper place as witness to the universe. At all other times, the seer is identified with that which is given to consciousness to perceive. Basic fundamental stuff. So, do we want to get rid of our ego? The answer is no. You cannot live in this plane of existence without an ego, or you can't really function. There are a few guys, probably up in the Himalayas, that have just completely lost their ego. And you can find them sitting in a cave, not doing anything, staring at a wall. Once or twice a week, their followers come, they do devotions to them, they dust them off, you know, they trim their nails, you know, they do whatever they do with them. And that's it. Without an ego, you do not know not to wander into traffic on a freeway. You don't know not to walk off that cliff. You don't know to eat when you're hungry. You don't know to sleep when you're tired. These are all functions of the ego. Therefore, we do not work to lose the ego. We work to awaken the ego. The ego, when it is awake and when the essence is disattached from it, is quiet. You know that state where the voices in your head aren't there anymore? And you're feeling really aware of this place, this time, right now, and there's no talking in your head? You've all touched that. That is the machine being awake. When the machine is asleep, that's where you get the talking in your head because, sorry, don't worry, it's not coronavirus. Uh, the talking in your head, the voices that are yammering at you, are part of the sleep of the machine. Is this making sense so far? You don't have to believe it. I'm just outlining the
Any thoughts so far
yeah.
that people want to interject or ask questions about? Oh, Marcelo has a question.
Yes.
Does it make some kind of accumulation in us? Does it produce some kind of emotional, physical garbage?
Yes. It actually affects the patterns of your body. If any of our Australians were here, we could definitely talk about that with them because they deal with that all the time with their therapeutic modality that they use. The ego is of the body. It lives in the brain and the nervous system and the muscles and the tendons and the fascia and the organs. This is why when you do some of this deep tissue work like Rolfing, you get, you know, huge waves of stuff coming up for you. And then when you're done with the sessions, those things are maybe gone. Because you have broken the pattern that holds them there. This is my theory on why people get old. You can age, and that's different than getting old. Getting old is where your life gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and you can do less and less and less, and you can move less and less and less until the day where you can't move at all. That's getting old. Aging is just going through years.
me go back to, I guess, your earlier point. I'm not quite sure if I'm clear on your model here. I mean, I certainly understand stimulus response in a traditional sense, like, putting your hand on a hot stove and it jerking your back. I mean, and what seems to characterize that is that there's no conceptual thought intervening, as you're pointing out. But now, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that also most of the stuff which is mediated by conceptual thought is also part of this layer that you're talking about, which I guess you're calling the commanding self.
I am in fact suggesting exactly that.
Okay.
Because most of the time people don't think, they react. And they don't react to the actual stimulus. They usually react to something that's in their head.
Right.
So if you're operating entirely from your ego and I say to you, hey, your mother wears combat boots, and you have an immediate emotional reaction to that,
right,
that's ego.
Okay. So, so what would be an example at this layer, something which is not ego, I guess? Because I mean, I'm pretty clear on this, hot stove, because that seems very clear. But now when we go beyond that, I mean, I recognize what you just said, namely this sort of immediate emotional reaction.
Or I say, your political candidate sucks the tailpipe of Harley Davidson motorcycles.
Right.
And you have immediate emotional reactions to that.
So is the criterion then this immediacy of the response? Is that
it's
what
the
makes
mindlessness of the response?
The mindlessness of the response. And by mindlessness,
the fact that the response is pretty much pre-programmed.
Pre-programmed, okay. So anything which doesn't have an intervening, examination is before the response. That's anything that doesn't have that you would call part of this commanding self.
Yeah, pretty much. When the thalamus becomes active before any higher functions become active and takes over the process.
Okay.
So if we want to use like pop psychology language, we might say being triggered, like finding those triggers.
Yeah, being triggered. That's a good one.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily say that pejoratively either. Like this is a thing that happens, and it happens.
Right. I get that. But now, one of the examples you mentioned was avoiding stepping into traffic. Now, I avoid stepping in traffic all the time, but it doesn't feel like an immediate stimulus response type thing.
But I would suggest if you examined what happens when you walk up to a busy street, you don't go through the cognitive steps of realizing that the street is busy and it could hurt you to walk out there. You just know.
You know not to, ideally anyway. Yeah. You've gotten it into your physical system that stepping over the curb into the vulnerability of being in traffic is something that's not good for you.
What it actually seems to be happening, at least in my observation, I come to the curb and I immediately realize that there may be danger there, so I look both ways, right?
Yeah. And is that not a programmed response?
Well, it is a programmed response, but now
then that means it's of the ego. I'm not saying that this is bad.
I'm not getting into the good or bad part of it. I'm just trying to understand exactly what counts as part of this commanding self layer.
Well, I think that's so legitimate.
It's actually really good questions, because this is hard shit to talk about. Yeah. We don't have a good way to language this. But I would say that the ego works heuristically. It makes heuristic choices all the time. Rules of thumb. Stepping out into traffic is bad. Look both ways before you step. You can do it completely unconsciously. You don't even think about it. It's just there.
So then are you saying that anything which you don't have to think about that you do is part of this layer?
Probably.
Okay.
Anything is a big word.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, because I mean, what I'm bothered with is that the hot stove example is crystal clear. And now the question is how far we extend that.
Let me suggest to you that your tendency to be bothered by stuff like this is also some of that, because it comes not from your thought so much as your immediate reaction, and then thought comes later.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that doesn't mean that it's bad. Again, this is not saying that your reaction is in any way negative.
Right.
It's probably a well-trained reaction so that you can automatically be skeptical of shit that's being flung at you.
Yeah, I'm completely abstracting from the good-bad aspect of this.
Good.
I'm just trying to understand exactly what you're pointing to here. Okay.
So that's what I'm pointing to.
All right, I think I'm getting clearer on it.
Good.
Okay, I've got, well, from the kind of models I'm used to, the level of fear you're talking about as a default, you know, I would have assumed it was a result of trauma. Now, I don't know whether this is just plain wrong or everybody's traumatized or what.
Well, you could use a trauma model, and in a lot of cases, that's very accurate.
Yeah. I mean, that's one way that I understand this personally. Yes.
And sometimes the trauma is not real.
Mm-hmm.
You decide that something is traumatic at some level of your ego. But probably fundamentally, all of this starts with traumas of various sorts.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, the other thing was, this is self-preservation.
Yeah.
There are some people who are very reflexive about hurting themselves.
Yep. But they do it for self-preservation. This is the weird thing about this. Even when you get somebody who's like a cutter, and they'll sit there with a razor blade and slice their arm all day, they're doing that to protect themselves. And I know this for a fact because I had to deal with a cutter, a really bad cutter, a person whose forearms were scarred from here to here. It was just one big massive scar tissue. And they were doing it as protection from something that was perceived to be a greater damage.
I suppose one way of looking at this whole trauma thing is that the trauma may be what creates the program for that response. In other words, you get programmed by the trauma, maybe one way of putting it.
Could very well be.
Yeah.
Marcelo has a question here.
Yes, he does. I just wanted to get let the dialogue going. But okay. Marcelo asks, can we say that the natural, quote unquote, natural state is just mindfulness, non-judgment, open awareness, and everything added on top of that is the ego?
You could say that, and you would be more or less accurate. What it is deeper than mindfulness. I consider the whole mindfulness practice to be pretty surface layer, which doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just a beginning. But the whole awakeness, mindfulness, non-judgmental is probably a part of it, because judgment is a function of the ego. Open awareness, that's all part of it, and most everything on top of it is ego, at least according to this model. So once you realize, and this is the trick, is that you have to realize that you're a meat puppet. Nobody wants to look at that. And yet, it is the first essential step to growth, to go, oh, damn, I guess I am a machine. My stimulus response mechanism is in control of my life. When you realize that, you begin to move from the commanding self to what we call the blaming self. And the blaming self is not like blaming you. It's actually where you start developing some very important traits. And the two traits that begin to happen here are consciousness or conscience. When you are a complete stimulus response machine, you virtually have no conscience. When you are at this next phase of your awakening, you start developing conscience. You start being able to perceive the other as subject rather than object. And you begin to develop the capacity for self-observation. And that is very important because the self-observation allows you to see the actions of the machine in your life. When you start getting a taste of this blaming self, this self that's going, hey, wait a minute, what about this? This action that you just took unconsciously actually created pain in this other individual, or created happiness in this other individual, or affected them in some way. And you're aware of that, and you start examining your behavior, examining your thoughts, observing them, even more than examining them. You don't want to do analysis. You want to watch them. Watch the flow of mechanical behavior as it crosses your field of awareness. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. When you spend a little time there, you get to the next stage, the third stage. This is where things start getting to be fun. This is called the inspired self. The inspired self, it starts developing some positive traits like generosity, gratitude, empathy, a desire for the work, and a thing that is in the tradition called modesty, though it's not the kind of modesty that people think of. It's not like, oh, I am not going to show my body parts because that's immodest. That has nothing to do with it. This kind of modesty is not allowing the ego to do self-aggrandizement, because the ego likes to do that. The ego likes to say, hey, you're the best. We're number one. We're number one.
The way I've interpreted that is keeping perceptions that you have about yourself and that other people have about you right-sized. You're not unduly downplaying things about yourself, but you're definitely not upplaying either. And when someone comes up to you and says something that makes you feel put on a pedestal, then you politely or forcefully, if the case needs that, challenge that. You make sure that you do your best to make sure that they perceive you in an accurate way.
Exactly right. So there are habits that go along with this level, just like there were habits that went along with the last one. And they tend to manifest as backbiting, trickery, especially tricking yourself, conceitedness, hypocrisy, self-consciousness, guilt, fearfulness, wishful thinking, an intense desire to please others for reward, basically, codependency, and covert narcissism.
So these go with the second layer, the second level.
Yep, you're right. They do. Excuse me.
That's okay. I mean, it's good to cover
Yeah,
this
we got to have those in there.
Yeah. And I've also put them in the the comment, the
Okay, good.
chat too.
I have a quick question. Is there any way of saving the stuff that you're putting in the chat box right now?
You
If
can
it goes
cut and
away
paste
once
it,
the, what?
but I can also, you know, if Mashak's on board with that as well, I can also share that for everyone to read later. But,
Share it with Ilmar. Oh no. Yeah.
God, I might find a weakness in you.
Actually, I save every chat log from every talk.
How do you save it though? I don't know. If
It is directly downloaded as a text file to my computer when I download the video.
as far as how you save it,
I don't think it does. It certainly doesn't for mine. You know.
yeah, I don't know if other people can
No,
do
it
that.
just comes to me. I don't know if I can set it for other people to do it. So we may have to just give it to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be helpful because I mean, especially like the stuff you're covering today. I mean, it'd
Yeah,
be really useful
there's a
to have
lot
that
of
material.
text content.
Yeah,
So
and there's even auto visual stuff.
yes, audio, visual stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just hit myself.
Yeah, there is no way that I can just allow you to have a copy of it.
I will
Unless you
post it though.
Yeah,
Great.
I
So
will
it's
get
not
it
a
to
problem.
Kyle. She will post it. She will post the graphic that goes with tonight.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and
But yeah,
that's
just
actually a very useful request. So
yep. And for the moment, you guys can just listen to us and follow along in the chat box. So and type in your questions as usual, of course. Okay, so we were just talking about the habits. I don't really want to put necessarily quote unquote bad on that yet, but we were talking about the habits of the second layer of the nafs, which involves the
Yep.
blaming self.
Yep. Now we're going to talk about the inspired self,
Yes.
and we talked about the traits,
Yep.
which are the generosity, gratitude, modesty, empathy, and ardent desire for the work, and the habits. Lacking in discrimination, mystical inflation, and a tendency towards spiritual greed. They use liberality, but it's in that word is kind of out of context for us because it's not being liberal. Lacking, think of it as lacking discrimination. You tend to lose your spiritual priorities and discernment, and everything is fascinating. Everything. You want to study with every teacher you meet, for instance. It's like, oh, I'm with Guru A. And then, oh my God, I met Sheikh B and he's incredibly cool. And now I want to study with him. But now we have Pandit C and they're also incredibly cool. And I want to go study with them. And you just get sucked into all of these and lose your center. And that's a habit of this particular station. You get here mostly by practicing generosity and gratitude. Empathy develops from that. But when people who I'm working with are starting to hit this point, I give them gratitude practices. It gets you over the hump. Mystical inflation is definitely a habit here. And the worst is spiritual greed.
How would you define that?
Well, a really smart lady said, wanting to eat everything at the spiritual buffet.
Yeah. Being kind of a consumer rather than truly connected, I would say. Like, I think I posted that meme today that's like talking about indigenous spirituality and
Yes.
people wanting to just jump on that and make it their own without having been invited in some way. And that is one way of looking at spiritual greed. That's one way it manifests.
Yep. And it's great for the con artists because they're just waiting for people like this.
Yep.
They want that so bad.
I thought I've read a little bit about spiritual greed. I thought a lot of it was for experiences rather than tools for getting experiences.
I think that it's both.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's both. I think uh, it can also probably manifest is when people decide they need to go on like 7 different plant medicine retreats so they can have those experiences, but they're not really sitting with them. Or even if they are, it's just like, okay, what about the next one? What about the next one? It's still got that consumer quality, that consumption quality.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like Trungpa's spiritual materialism.
Yeah, that's pretty much a good description of it. So then we get to the 4th level, the tranquil self. And this is where things start quieting down and looking pretty good. The traits that you find are dignity, sincerity, courage, compassion, and loyalty. Loyalty is where you start adhering to not the teacher per se, but the teaching. It's like, yeah, this is the teaching that's working for me. I'm going to stick with this. This is where your efforts to grow start paying off. And the habit that is at this state is the attachment to spiritual ambition. I want to become the teacher. I want to become the guru. I will be the sheikh. People will come and listen to me. I'm the one that knows. Moving right along, we have the 5th station, which is called the satisfied self. The traits are endurance, resignation, and constancy. This is where you sit down and you do the work. You endure the hard shit and you stay constant with your practices. You're not usually distracted by life's distracting shit. You are able to stay focused for more than 20 seconds at a time. And the loyalty is a way of being. It is, yes, I am devoted to the work. The habit is usually called personal identification with affliction, and it relates to the risk of spiritual bypassing through attachment to aesthetic, plain behavior, and self-presentation. One of the things that they say about this is at this point, when you hit this station, I believe that it's here, you stop wearing fancy clothes. You know, you don't wear the uniform of a dervish. You know how all the different dervish orders have different fancy robes that they wear to show that they are impoverished and, you know, spiritual and stuff. Those are the guys that I make fun of with the silly hats. So it's like in our tariqah, our uniform is a t-shirt and blue jeans. And except in the winter, then it's a sweatshirt and blue jeans. Some of us have special dispensation to make it a t-shirt and leggings. But not looking like anything, not wanting to look like anything is a part of this place on the path.
Yeah. I mean, just as an example, that doesn't necessarily indicate a level that I'm on. But early on in my my practice as a Sufi, I felt very called to wear a headscarf, not because I felt that covering myself was important, but I felt that demonstration was important. I felt being seen was important. And that was kind of like a socio-political desire to be noticed, I guess we could say. And there are some things wrapped up in that that I needed to unpack. And that's why I don't wear it anymore, because I realized that that was not the best way of learning to be the kind of person I wanted to be.
Yep. In other words, you grew up.
Well, yep.
Yep.
Pretty much. Glad
Damn
I
it.
had the
Yeah.
experience and glad to say goodbye to it.
Yep.
That was almost
So,
5 years of my life, so
yep. And you learned some stuff. That's for sure.
definitely did, yes.
So the 6th level is called the satisfying self. The traits here are knowledge of the divine unity, sincerity. Most important is unbounded faith. Now, this has nothing to do with belief. We have to make that distinction. Faith has nothing to do with belief. And when you understand the difference, you'll understand why that's important. I'm not even going to go into the difference right now because that's for a different talk. Just take it that faith and belief are different. And the biggest problem when you get to this state is mystical intoxication, a lack of sobriety and balance. You get addicted to the bliss of getting lost in cosmic consciousness. And believe it or not, that is a major trap. That's something that people fall into, you know. We get all blissed out. That back in the 60s, that's what all of us hippies wanted. We wanted to be permanently blissed out. And people didn't realize that that also meant permanently non-functional. But you have that, and then you get to the final stage, which is called the purified self. The traits here are freedom from duality, acceptance of the divine presence as the motivating force for existence, the joy of being united with that infinite presence, freedom from expectation, and most importantly, contentment. Contentment is one of the most underrated traits that we can develop. And there are no habits at this point. This is the point where the machine is wide awake and it's paying attention and it's quiet. It is no longer chattering at you all the time. It's just quiescent. Now, this is not the end of the path. This is where you are. Zainab, she's here. Zainab, we missed you.
Hello.
Hello, welcome back. Did you miscalculate the change in time zones?
That's okay. Don't worry. We'll have a replay.
We like you anyway.
Yeah.
Don't worry. We have it all recorded.
Yeah.
Okay.
We are done. We are actually now going to take a look at what this looks like on an Enneagram. So y'all tell me when you see this.
Got it.
I see it, yeah.
Good. Okay, you'll notice that there are two things here. This is awake in the dream. This is lucid dreaming. This is where, here we are in samsara, but we are awake in it. These two are awake from the dream, and that's a different process. So if you notice here, we look and we go, oh, there are the two shock points, the inspired self and the pleasing self. Those are the two that you have to get through. And remember, to get through the shock at point 3, will must be involved. And if you look back on your notes, or if I look back on your notes for you,
What part?
At point 3, the traits are the generosity,
Sure.
the gratitude. And I said that gratitude is one of the main practices. That gratitude allows you to engage your will in what you're doing. And that's the ardent desire that is also one of these traits. You have this desire to advance, and you have a gratitude for your states, and that gets you to the tranquil nafs. Remember, 4 is basically the honeymoon point. So when you move past this shock and you get here, things are pretty nice at point 4. A lot of people stay here forever.
I mean, that was where we mentioned that the work starts paying off. You start feeling more confident and settled within yourself, and you feel loyal to your work.
Mm-hmm.
But you also start to become caught up in where you're at. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you see yourself growing and you think, damn, I'm a big shot now.
Yeah.
When little do you know how little you know. Yeah.
Yeah. But then you get over to point 5 here, the pleased, satisfied self. And you've crossed the equator. There is no going back from this point. And this is where the grind starts. This is where you start doing the work of constantly pulling yourself into the awakened state, using your self-observation and your self-remembering. Remember, self-observation starts at 2. Self-remembering starts at 4. Self-remembering works its ass off at 5. And you do enough work there and you get to 6. The pleasing, satisfying self. This is the second shock, and this is the shock that requires surrender to a higher power on your part. This is the place that we first start, we talk about at 5 and 6, we start talking about the divine connection.
Yeah. I mean, this is where we start talking about where, we did do a talk about this previously. We started talking about faith, and that's not necessarily faith in the stereotypical sense where it's like you're handing over your intellectual capacity and just thinking, okay, whatever. But you're invested in getting through it. You're committed to holding on and not letting go.
And it's faith that gets you through this second shock. And then you get to the purified self. At this point, you return along the one line and the student literally becomes the teacher here. But all of this is awake in the dream. All of this is lucid dreaming. These two here, fanafillah means annihilation in God. Baqa billah means subsistence in God. God meaning the divine unity as you understand it. My teacher said, my very first teacher said, when you do your work and you come to the point of annihilation, God destroys your ego for you. But because you cannot live without an ego, he gives you a new one immediately. And that new one is a mirror of his. This is secret stuff. Nobody knows this, supposedly. I mean, Kyle never ran across this in all of her years of study
Nope.
until she heard it from me, which probably says more about her other teachers than it does me.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we talked about Fana, but I mean, that's almost a pop culture thing now.
Yep.
Annihilation, and beyond that, it was understood to some extent that there was nothing. So
Yeah, but beyond that, there is baqa, which means subsistence. It means existing with or existing in. So your state and the divine state are one state. Your station and the divine station are one station. You are the eyes through which he sees, and the ears through which he hears, and the mouth through which he speaks, and the hands through which he works, and the feet through which he moves. That's what that one is.
mm,
That's some heavy stuff. And this diagram will be passed around in the forum, so you'll all be able to get it there.
yeah, along with the notes. As soon as
Along with the
when
notes.
the video gets posted tomorrow, I will have the notes up.
Yep. And so that, and I'm going to get rid of this so that we can talk here. That is a general outline of the 7 levels of the nafs and basically how you work with them. I mean, this is an incredibly superficial view of them because we've only got, well, we've actually been going for almost an hour and a half. But we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about this stuff, though we will come back to it again and again and again.
Yeah. Because this is the roadmap. This is a roadmap at the very least. And when we feel stuck, we can rely on that. We can turn to that to give us some direction.
So, any questions?
Yeah, actually, 6 is the blissed out point, right? Or risk of being blissed out?
6 can be blissed out. 4 and 6 are the 2 blissy points.
Yeah, I was wondering what the difference is between blissed out and 0.7 where things get better.
At 0.7, you're actually in a state of sobriety. You're not in a
settled
state
down.
Yeah, everything is settled down.
You're kind of over the highs that come with hitting the previous points.
Yeah, when I said things get better, I didn't mean they got more blissful. I meant they got, in some general sense, improved, but I wasn't sure quite what the improvement was.
The improvement is moving from bliss to contentment.
Okay.
That's the biggest change.
If we want to tie it back to the beginning, I mean, at that point, you're getting your trauma reactions, your trauma programming generally worked out of your system. You're not relying on those to dictate your behavior and your reactions to things.
Yeah.
In fact, you're not necessarily reacting, but you can respond.
Yes.
Without
and your ego is your ego is in its proper place, doing the reactions that need to be done, but not playing all of the old shit over and over and over again to keep you fixated. So you will not wander into traffic. You will not set yourself on fire. You will not hit yourself on the head with a hammer. Your ego will make sure that you don't do these foolish things. But it will not continually nag you with what Aunt Mary said to you 20 years ago that hurt your feelings. And you will not be afraid unless it's appropriate. Instead of going, oh my God, a tiger could walk into the room any moment, you go, there's no tiger until there is. When there's a tiger, you react as appropriate for a tiger. When there is no tiger, you do not act as if there is a tiger. Whereas the commanding self is always acting as if there is a tiger. Noor, thoughts?
I was just thinking, I mean, reflecting on everything that you've talked about, that can help. The fact that we're calling it the commanding self, that can help it make sense that we call it that, because the programs are running you. The trauma programs, the, bias programming, all that stuff is running you. It commands you. You work your way out of that as you progress through these stages.
Yep. And at the 7th stage, those programs do not command you, they serve you. That's the biggest difference.
Is that making sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Good. Any questions on any of the content that we've discussed?
I mean, yes. First thing, I guess, I mean, this talk was definitely something very different from what I expected. I mean,
that's a good thing. I like
no, it
to
is a good thing.
learn
That's why I'm sticking around with interest here. So it's, and again, I'm abstracting from the good and bad anyway. So what it obviously is a map of stages of spiritual development, right? I mean, rather than things that we in some sense identify with, which some people talk about as ego identifications, but that's a completely different thing. So sticking now with your stages of development thing, I'm going to have to, look through your notes and try to, grok this better, because it's my first exposure to this stuff. But the immediate question is the shock points. I mean, the first one you said was a shock point because it's the first time that will gets involved?
Yes.
Is that...
Yep.
And the second one was a shock point. What was the external input there?
Your surrender gets involved.
And that's also an act of will, basically? Is that what you're saying?
In a certain sense, but it's an act of letting go.
Letting go of, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so
this is where you rely on faith.
Okay.
Which is different than belief.
It's more like a relaxation into the way things are. Okay.
Yeah, relaxation into the way things are, and knowing that there is a connection that moves you through everything.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. And so before the first shock point, you're suggesting there is no function of the will involved at all. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much. You start getting the will active at point 2.
Right.
But you don't really commit to using your will until point 3.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to have to go through this a few times and make sense of it. But it's a model. I mean, I appreciate the model.
Hundreds of times, and I still don't completely understand it.
Yeah.
I suspect that you actually never understand it. You just know it.
Because you've experienced it? Is that what you're saying?
Because you've experienced it. When you experience it, you know it. It's really hard to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it refers to places that go beyond language symbolism.
That is where, teachers come in handy if they've been to these places before you, because even when you can't necessarily verbalize this stuff, a teacher can show you the way.
Right.
Can
Or at
give
least they can
you-
hit you with the Zen stick.
Yeah. I mean, whatever works, right? Yeah.
Right. You can certainly you can point to something that you yourself have experienced, and hopefully the other person will recognize, at least in some
Yeah.
degree, recognize that.
That's why building rapport is so important, because then you see those qualities in them. You
Gotcha.
see the the trail markers
Right.
being laid out for you.
And so it becomes partly your job as a teacher to demonstrate each of these phases, or not?
Kind of, to mirror each of these phases.
Or just, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the transcript here, or at least the notes here. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Omar. Anyone else?
Yeah, you have particularly good questions tonight, Ilmar.
I acknowledge your wisdom and all that stuff.
Nancy, did you have a question?
Well, more of a comment, which is I think this is a very good lecture for me, because I think I have a habit of expecting myself to just get things right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And getting this detailed description of how you're learning, but as you're learning, you are necessarily fucking up in different ways,
Yeah.
Exactly right.
is kind of reassuring.
Yes, and it should be reassuring, because every step builds upon the next. And as Mishtak and I were talking about last night as we were going over this stuff, we are all bouncing back and forth between these levels, but it's where we live that indicates, where we're at on the Enneagram cycle for this. And so we're going to fuck up, and we're going to have moments where we exceed our own expectations about, like, wow, maybe I suck less at life than I thought. Like, it goes both ways.
Yep. And that's the thing. You don't just do these sequentially. You hit, like, you're at 1 and you start touching 2, and you do 2 more and more and more and more, and then you hit 3, and you haven't even finished with 2 completely yet, but you're at 3 and you're bouncing back between 1 and 3, and then you cross that threshold to 4, and then you're going to just bounce back between 3 and 4 usually. You rarely go back to 2. And then you just keep going, but you just get in position where you live at one point and then touch the other points, which is different than just bouncing around on them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you live at 3 and you occasionally touch 2 and you occasionally touch 4 and maybe you even reach over and hit 5 every now and again and then bot back, that's more what the progress actually looks like in my experience. You don't just go, boom, I'm at this level of nafs and I'm going to stay here forever now.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those weird things where you also don't want to be, traditionally speaking, you are supposed to keep where you're at to yourself, your level. And the reason for that is because it's not a race. You're not supposed to be super attached to your station. It's just one of those things where you're traveling through it. That is your journey. Don't let other people distract you from that.
Yeah, and in the traditional Sufi schools, if you go around bragging about what station you're at, you're going to catch some hell from the teacher. You're going to find yourself scrubbing latrines until your ego has been reduced a little bit.
So nothing like separate different stripes on your robes.
No, absolutely not. Yes.
No.
Yeah.
No, there are no ranks. There are jobs, but there are no ranks. And the number of times that the cook became the next sheikh is actually larger than one might think. Or the stable boy becomes the next teacher. back in all the old Sufi stories.
Yeah.
So, okay, so actually that raises kind of an interesting point. I mean, sometimes there seems to be value in, I don't want to say certifying, but in acknowledging a certain state. And sometimes it seems like we need an external acknowledgement of that state.
In Sufism, what you get is called ijaza, which means permission. So I received my ijaza to teach from my teacher, what was it? 1996? 97, somewhere in there. I have to look on it.
And that's a piece of paper, right?
It's just a piece of paper. It says, you are hereby granted this right to teach in this way and to minister to people. In some ways, it's an ordination.
And does it have a subjective value for you? Does it solidify in some sense?
No, not at all.
No, okay.
For me, it was literally just a way that made it easier for me to do my work.
Because
it has legal standing.
I see. Not because it gave you more confidence or anything of that sort, right?
Not for me.
Gotcha.
Let's ask Kyle, because hers is newer than mine. How does that make you feel that you now have ijaza?
I think in the beginning it felt like a confidence booster and also a conferring of responsibilities, but I think I've been humbled since then. I've definitely felt like, yeah, okay, I have this position now, but what do I do with it? How do I live into it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't magically get bestowed on me just because I've received ijaza.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I've actually, to some degree, noticed you over these discussions. I mean, some almost holding back from taking on that role.
Oh yeah, it's terrifying. And I think that owning that sets a good example too. Like, that's why I'm saying it right now. I have had a resistance to stepping into that role, and that's my NAF stuff. That's my stuff to work through. And that comes from my lifetime experiences, my social training, my records that play in my head over and over again. And my goal ultimately is to take these experiences and turn them into teaching opportunities.
So it sounds like, at least in your case, that commanding self, if I got the scheme correct, was still operative. Even though in your development stages, you're presumably way past that, right?
I mean, we can look at that way. I mean, I like to take an approach of humility. Like, I'm definitely not a purified, I'm not embodying a purified nafs right now. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I certainly have watched myself grow. And I know when I'm operating from a place of nafs. I see it. I can practically taste it when it's happening.
And that tells you that she's not at the station of the commanding self.
Yeah.
Because by that point, you're doing the self-observation at least, right?
Yes, at least.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, basically, you're going to do the self-observation through the entire path. You pick up other stuff. You get the self-remembering comes in around 4, and the self-witnessing comes in around 6.
Okay. Remind me again quickly the self-remembering. What exactly was that as supposed to distinguish?
Self-remembering is basically observing yourself being present.
Okay.
Being awake, knowing that you're awake, being in the world, and being reflexive in your thought too. Being aware of your awareness, being aware of the world, and here you are in it.
Gotcha.
And I'll actually put a link probably up here to the talk on those three, because it's always good to go back and revisit those.
All right. Cool.
Yeah, and that will be at the end of the talk. So you have to get all the way to the end of this talk before you see that card up there, that tells you where you can go and learn those practices.
Yep.
Other
Utilize.
questions? Yes.
What?
I
No.
thought Elmar was about to say something else.
No, I was about to let you
damn it.
continue talking.
All right, any other questions? Zainab, did any of this make sense to you?
Yes, it did. It was
Yay.
late, but it was good.
Good. All right. Then we are going to wrap this up for this evening. Do we have any specific announcements to make?
Not at this moment, I don't believe.
Okay.
So,
Like us.
yes, like, subscribe,
Like,
join us
subscribe,
next time.
join our Facebook group. There will be a link down
Yes.
below.
Nine-sided circle.
Nine-sided circle forum. Yes, join that
Yes.
and talk with us. Other things, whatever they are, they're there. All right. So good night, everyone, and we will see you next week.